When Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote Tarzan of the Apes, he gave us the origin of a very compelling character in Tarzan and told us where he came from. But it didn't tell us where he was going or what Burroughs would do with him in future stories. For that, we need to look to the last half of the second novel, Return of Tarzan, where Burroughs defines the type of hero Tarzan will be and what he's going to do with that character. And so I would say that the second novel is actually almost as important for Tarzan as the first. And so if you're Dark Horse Comics and you're only going to do one adaptation of a Tarzan novel in the 90s, it does make sense to do the last half of Return of Tarzan. And it also makes sense to get one of the best Tarzan artists of all time to do it. And so this is a review of The Return of Tarzan by Thomas Yeats. And so I'm going to do a review, and then I'm going to talk about where this fits in with Tarzan history in the 90s, how this fit in with me discovering the character, and where this fits into an absolutely brilliant reintroduction of the character to modern audiences by Dark Horse Comics. And so let's start with the covers for this 3-issue miniseries. They're not by Thomas Yeats, but they are very good. And this is one of my favorite Tarzan covers of all time because it perfectly captures this incredibly important moment in Tarzan's life. This is a moment that will define him as a hero and a human being. And it works just brilliantly. And we'll talk about the scene that this is capturing in a minute. The cover for issue 2 depicts the first of many lost cities that Tarzan will encounter in the novels, and this is the lost city of Opar, perfectly captured. We get ruins up front here, but we get more intact looking buildings that hint at the grandeur that Opar once had. We have La of Opar here looking enticing, but we can't quite read the look on her face, and behind her we can see the beastmen of Opar leering ominously. And the cover for issue 3 has Tarzan fighting a horde of beastmen over the bloodstained altar of Opar, and it is just a glorious image. This has been done in quite a few different covers, but this is a fantastic one. The beastmen are definitely more ape than man, probably a little more ape than I've seen them, but that's the cool thing about Tarzan art. There's just all kinds of different interpretations, and it's always cool to see them all. So this comic is written and drawn by Thomas Yeats, and the artwork is just not just utterly beautiful, but the story it tells is just so perfectly done. I mean, the layout of the panels, the way the word balloons are placed, everything just works so well. It tells you a lot of story in a small amount of time, but nothing ever feels compressed or covered up or cramped or anything like that. If I had to show someone how to put out a comic book and do effective storytelling, this miniseries is absolutely one of the things that I would hand to them. As I've said before, this comic covers the last half of Return of Tarzan, but I don't feel like you're missing anything at all not having that first half of the novel. It picks up perfectly, and there's nothing wrong with the first half of the novel. It's perfectly fine, but the last half is the best part and the most important part of the story. And if you do want the whole novel in comic form, you can pick up Joe Kubert's version of it. You can pick up the reprints of the original newspaper comic strips. There's also a really cool adaptation of the first half of Return of Tarzan in the first episode of Tarzan the Epic Adventures, which you can watch on Tubi. So the comic begins after Tarzan spent some time in civilization. He's been tossed off of a boat and washes up on the shore of Africa. And so up till now, Tarzan has had pretty much only negative interactions with the natives. The tribe of Mbonga killed his mother, tried to kill his friends, and so now Tarzan is naked and unarmed in the jungle, and he sees a native coming by, and he contemplates going Grand Theft Jungle on this guy and stealing his stuff, but then a lion comes along, and Tarzan takes the side of the native over the lion. Which is a good thing because this warrior turns out to be part of a tribe called the Waziri, who are very friendly and open to Tarzan, and he is completely down with the way that these folks live their life. He feels a kinship for them that he doesn't feel for the primitive animals or for the duplicitous and complex societies he's seen in the West, this is the first time in Tarzan's life that he really feels like he belongs somewhere. And so when slave raiders attack the Waziri, their chief dies and Tarzan leads them to victory, and so they crown him the new chief. And in the second issue, we'll start weaving in a subplot with Jane, who is shipwrecked and stranded in the middle of the sea. And we'll also have Tarzan go to Opar, which is the first lost city, which of course he assumes is abandoned ruins. He's basically there to find some gold that he's heard is there. But Burroughs' lost cities are never abandoned, and so we do have the Beastmen of Opar. And so as you can imagine, any lost city that's been isolated from civilization for millennia is going to be in bad shape, and Opar is the worst because its inhabitants are devolving down the evolutionary scale. Except for the women, who are still pretty human, and that includes the high priestess and ruler of Opar, La. And so La ends up becoming kind of sometimes an enemy, sometimes an ally of Tarzan. She sometimes wants to sacrifice him to the sun god, and at other times she wants to force him to be her mate. And so she is a rather complex, interesting character that we'll go back to again and again in the novels. And I don't think I'm spoiling anything to say that Tarzan and Jane do end up together by the end of the novel and do end up getting married. Jane is actually a damsel in distress in this novel. It wouldn't be until the third Tarzan novel where she would start fighting back and escaping on her own, which would become a trope that you would see over and over again with Burroughs' female characters in his novels. And one thing to note, that this is not available in trade paperback or digitally, so you have to get the original issues. And I do hope that that is fixed at some point, because this is a seminal piece of storytelling that should absolutely be available for modern audiences. But one added bonus, when you do get the original issues, is that there are reproductions of original covers from the magazines that ran Return of Tarzan. And so let's talk about where this comic adaptation fits in to Tarzan in the 90s, right? So in my last retro review, and no, you haven't missed anything, it was talking about Tarzan A Tale of Mugambi, which was the first Tarzan comic Dark Horse put out in 1995. Now, you may be saying, but Todd, the next one that came out would have been Tarzan versus Predator or Tarzan John Carter, both of which were published in January 1996. And yes, those were the next comics that were published, right? But those weren't necessarily the next comics that people read. And so to give you a little bit of background, Diamond Comics, which does the distribution for comic books in America, puts out a catalog called Previews. And so Previews used to be distributed free to customers in comic shops. And actually at the beginning of the 90s, it was actually mandatory. My comic shop had actually dropped want lists and made you actually use the order forms in Previews to order whatever it was you wanted. By the mid-90s, they had actually dropped that practice, but everyone I knew still regularly got this. We religiously read Previews. This was how we knew what was coming out, and this sold a lot of comics. And comic publishers knew that, so they would have all kinds of articles and extras and previews and samples inside of Previews. But some companies took this to the next level and actually had entire issues that were serialized in Previews. And so you would get 2 to 4 pages an issue, and it would really give you a feel of what that series was like. And so in an absolutely brilliant move, from October of 1995 to August of 1996, Dark Horse Comics serialized the first issue of Return of Tarzan in Previews. And that was a very smart move for a couple of different reasons. First of all, Tarzan had been absent from mainstream pop culture for a long time, right? If you missed Greystoke and Tarzan the Ape Man in the early 80s, which I certainly did, you didn't have any chance for exposure before the 90s. There was no comic series put out, nothing, right? And so when we got to the 90s, right, we did get Tarzan comics from Malibu, but this was a smaller publisher, so less people noticed it and picked it up. And this was a different version of Tarzan. And so some fans, kind of had mixed reactions to it. I thought they were brilliant, but some people just didn't care for it. And so at this point, I myself had not been exposed to Tarzan. I still had just stereotypes of really old movies, that he was this dumb guy, spoke broken English, fought poachers, and that was pretty much all me and my friends thought of the character. And so what putting this issue in previews did was, for old fans and retailers, it let them know that this was going to be the Tarzan that they remembered, right? This was the Tarzan from back in the good old days with Joe Kubert and Russ Manning and John Buscema, right? And for newer fans like me, it let us know who this character was. And so while researching these retro reviews, I realized that while Tarzan vs. Predator is indeed probably the first Tarzan comic I bought, the first few chapters of the serialization of Return of Tarzan would have been the first Tarzan comics I've ever read. And it acted as a great introduction to the character. For me, it let me know that when I picked up Tarzan vs. Predator, not expecting to be like, me Tarzan, you Predator, right? But what it also did was it showed me a different aspect of the character, right? This shows me that Tarzan is a badass and can fight interesting villains. But this shows me who Tarzan is as a character. And that's also very important when you're trying to sell a character to audiences, right? I could identify with this guy, right? I, as an angsty teenager, could get down with him rejecting civilization and finding himself in the jungle and all of that stuff. And so probably that really helped enhance my curiosity about the character. And we'll talk more about that when I do my review of Tarzan vs. Predator. And so I think it goes without saying that The Return of Tarzan by Thomas Yeats gets my highest possible recommendation. If you can get a hold of this miniseries, you owe it to yourself to read it. All right, guys, like and subscribe for more videos. And until next time, see ya.